When I was growing up, Christmas was very much a family thing. It had a magic about it, I think, as I was developing. It was gathered around a family. We lived on a small farm outside a town called Yenda. We didn't have a lot of transport those days, and it was mainly spent at home. And the activities, I remember my mum and dad somehow used to get into town. They'd come home with all sorts of things we didn't know they had. But that aside, there was always a bustling around the place. You know, we had fowls, and the chook had to be caught, and whose turn was it to pluck the jolly thing? But then there was the mum in the kitchen, and the little black stove, and the wood that she piled in there, and it was a tumultuous sort of thing in a way. When I look back, I think, how on earth did she manage 5 children in those conditions? And my father always had, it was an orchard, and there was always seasonal picking. And at that time, as well as thinking about Christmas, that was going to be a very important part of our family life, he had to be thinking of, did the grapes have to be picked? How about the apricots that were ripening and so forth? And church was about, a little township of Yenda is about 5 miles away, and we didn't go to church at Christmas. It was, as I look back, it was a sort of a spiritual thing that was within the home. There was love and care and concern. There was a magic about it that I didn't question at all at that time. And as I started to grow up, the memories of that family life, perhaps you might say it wasn't a spiritual background there, but as I look back, there must have been something extra that bound us all together and enabled the magic of Christmas and the feeling that went with it, the value and respect and love that came through as we look back and think of what our parents tried to do when the conditions were rather meagre, because it was in the Depression years. I'm talking about the early 30s now, and my memories of Christmas are of those days and the value they were to us, even though they were simple in their nature. They were important in a warmth that coexisted with this concept of Christmas. And then as I grew up, the Christmas feeling and the understanding matured and questioned itself from that sort of foundation. Christmas was being memorable to me now because of a whole kaleidoscope of Christmases. But I suppose when we had our first child, and when he was old enough to just sit up and be part of Christmas, to see him on Christmas morning, and we were responsible then. My wife, whose name was Doreen, and she came to this church here at Terrigal, and I were full of love for him, and to see his growing awareness of Christmas. And I sense in him, although he is not outspoken about it, just by his attitude to Christmas, those memorable days when he was young and we were young parents, and we tried to nurture him in his growing up stages, that behind Christmas there's a deeper feeling of the spirituality of Christmas and the meaning and the stretching out towards the birth of Christ on that day. And I look back at that, and I say a prayer for my wife, who's not with me anymore now, but she was the leader in that side of Christmas, and the memorable Christmas for Gilbert, my son, and for me, not only came from the spirit of Christmas in its true sense, but that which was nurtured by my wife, who opened up this avenue of a deeper understanding of Christmas.
Were you at 2 Christmases at the war?
Yes, I was. I was in the first Christmas. I was in northern Queensland on the Atherton Tablelands, and we had done advanced training there and in preparation for going overseas. And just before Christmas, they took us down across the mountains to a sugar town called Mosman in Queensland, where there was a sugar mill. And this was a sort of a celebration for us, and we had Christmas in this sugar mill, and all you could do is smell sugar. But that was this type of service that I was in. I was in an infantry battalion, the 7th Division. It was part of 7th Div, and there were no frills or anything like that. What you had, you carried, and we were ready to go away, and we were stripped down to the bare minimum. And Christmas was that I can still smell the cold floor or the atmosphere of that sugar mill at Mosman. And several times in latter years, when we've gone back on pulling a caravan, I always pull up at Mosman and say to Doreen, or I used to say to Doreen, "Hey, can you smell that sugar?" Because it reminds me of a Christmas I had here. But another Christmas I had overseas was at a place called Rabaul in New Britain. As an infantry battalion, we'd taken place in the landing at Balikpapan in Borneo, and the war hadn't ended then. The activities hadn't ended there. But whilst I was in Borneo, peace was declared in July, and we were a very close-knit group of men in that unit. You had to be, and we were then demobilised, and we had formed such a dependence upon one another that they started to break down the unit, and they were moving troops home from active service, and I didn't get home on the first lot of ships because I was young and didn't have they worked out a point system. You had to be married and the number of years you'd been overseas and so forth. And so on the way back, I was, with others, was put down into Rabaul, and the rest of my mates and all those I knew so well went home. And Rabaul at that time, you could see that volcano across the harbour, and it was you could see the smoke belching out, and there's an awful smell of lava and so forth. And Christmas became miserable, and I'd say it made me think about Christmas, and I thought more deeply about it and more valued. And while I wasn't perhaps overt in my expression of that, it was an inner feeling that was there, and I'm sure it affected my overt attitudes towards things. And I wasn't happy until we sailed into Sydney Heads one day, and that was the most wonderful thing. Now, Christmas has passed, and this was in the new year, and it was summer, and we were on this troop ship coming in, and we're looking all crowded over the sides of the ship, looking, and the Manly ferries going by would give us a toot, and all the passengers on the ferry, I can remember, all rushed to the side and waved to us, and we came home and docked under the harbour there somewhere, and we were offloaded. But it had been a miserable Christmas, but I think it had its outcomes in other ways. Christmas, to me now, as I think when I think more deeply about it, it means I see it as a consolidation of my thoughts that have occurred around the Christmas story. The cynicism and the questions you may have had in periods of your life, the regrets but also the opportunities, all seem to go away. And there's a realization and an acceptance without question that there's a greater force in our lives, and in my life particularly, and it comes outwardly at Christmas more than it does in other times, when I think it's still playing a role in the very being and the very attitudes that I have. So Christmas now, as I see it, is a time when I don't question those things that I did. I now have an acceptance, and I think a deeper understanding and the culmination of thoughts in some way. And maybe, there's a greater culmination to come. But at this stage, Christmas today just means a lovely togetherness of the magic of Christmas and the childlike magic that goes with Christmas, that still exists and comes in some form of expression in my own heart and my own mind.